So obviously, historically, newspapers have mainly concentrated on, the great men and the great battles. But if you really delve in, you can find the details of the ordinary men and women who served in military capacities and indeed on the home front from the early 1700s right the way through to the modern times. The newspapers that we have on the site range from the 1700s to the 2000s, so you'd be quite staggered by what you can find in there. So if we move to my first slide, so we're just going to have a little overview of the history of war in newspapers, and there are 27 million mentions of the word war in the newspapers. So it's a little bit popular. Indeed, in newspaper history, war and newspapers go hand in hand.
I can imagine, actually, yeah.
And particularly when it comes to illustrations in newspapers and photography in newspapers. It's things like the Crimean War and the American Civil War in the 1860s, where you really begin to see photography come into newspapers. So we're going to have a look at what you can find. We're going to have a look at our specialist military titles, of which we have several.
I'm loving these images as well. These images are amazing.
Yes, and these are all coming from the newspapers, and I do have a little bias. I appreciate that most people have a bias towards photographs of their ancestors, but my bias is definitely towards the drawings. And so we'll have some search tips throughout then as well. If we move to the next.
Oh, back one.
Go. So as I said, our newspapers cover many of the conflicts that happened in the last 300 years. So you can start off with the War of Spanish Succession in the early 1700s and go right the way through to the Second World War and indeed beyond. So we know these wars by these names. But as they're happening, this is not what they're going to be called.
Of course, yeah.
You can't know that the 7 Years' War is the 7 Years' War.
Especially not if you're in year 2.
Yes, exactly. And also, wars tend to grow. They're like octopus, with tendrils almost, indeed. They sort of spread out and become other wars. So the 7 Years' War also had a component called the French and Indian War, or what we call the French and Indian War today. But the best way for you to narrow down your searches, because as I said, this is not how they're going to be known in historic sources, is to look at those dates. Go to internet sources, your history books, dare I say it, Wikipedia.
No, it is good for military history.
Those basics of, at least you'll know that the war happened in 1812. And so narrow your search down with the search function that's available on the website. So you can narrow down to a specific year, and then what I would suggest is beginning to search on other terms that will be coming up in the articles. So you're going to be looking at the combatants within the war. So you might look for something like French troops. We have to remember that newspapers are very much about us and them during a war.
Of course, propaganda heavy.
Propaganda heavy. It is about us and them, and so there's going to be an awful lot of articles about them.
Yes, I guess they need to sell the war to the general public, don't they?
They do indeed. Yeah. And it is that propaganda. There's a certain amount of not causing panic at home.
I can imagine.
So while there's integrity in reporting, in a way, your side is always winning until they lose. So you do have to kind of take what's written in the newspapers. It is somewhat surprising sometimes. Some of the newspapers can be quite hardline, and they will admit that things are happening that maybe the War Office wouldn't necessarily want them revealing.
And would that vary from title to title? I guess it's just the position of their owner or whoever was running it.
You get that as you move later into history, and also the First World War, there wasn't as much strictures on the sorts of letters that men were sending home, and those letters then made their way into the papers.
Okay.
So you can have quite poignant letters.
If you found something like that, you'd be reading your ancestors' experiences in their own words, which is incredible, and you simply wouldn't find that anywhere else, would you?
No, absolutely. And young men, they don't always think to protect their mother.
No.
So they send home these letters. But as I say, so a lot of these wars and these mutinies, rebellions, the modern names are not necessarily how they're going to be referred today. If we take the most obvious example, the First World War only became the First World War afterwards.
Of course, they need the second for it to be the first, I guess.
I believe it was called the First World War relatively soon after. It didn't wait until the second, but during it was sometimes the World War, because people did recognise that this was a very different conflagration than had happened before. But by the same token, you will just see it as the Great War or the World War or simply the war.
So Great War was a contemporary term then? Yeah. Okay.
It's all encompassing. I don't think any of us can conceive of living through 4 or 5 years of constant warfare. And my particular interest is in the home front in the Second World War. And if you think that rationing continued right into the 1950s...
Oh yeah, of course.
It's just that sort of level of deprivation and sort of that constant nervousness and as we all famously know, at the declaration of the Second World War, Virginia Woolf committed suicide, saying she couldn't go through it again. So if we move on to the next slide. So what can we find in newspapers? Army and Navy promotions and movements to new stations and ports, details of equipment, which I have to say is kind of an interest of mine as well, vehicles and uniforms. The logistics of war just fascinate me, how you move food and men, and the way the post went from England to France to the front in a matter of a day, and that they were able to get a letter from home within 24 hours.
It's also something you don't think of.
No,
all the behind the scenes work that tends to get forgotten.
We would completely struggle today, I think. Battlefield images, which are hugely detailed, and indeed the first slide had a battlefield image that was a drawing from the Second World War of Canadian troops moving across the battlefield. Casualty lists, as we discussed earlier. Casualty not always meaning that somebody died, but that they could be also missing a prisoner of war or injured. Rolls of honour, those tend to include the photographs. Those are the gentlemen who did pass, and they will have an entire page spread. Photographs in general, either the battlefield, of captured enemy soldiers, of their equipment, so you will also get information not just on the British troops, but also on the Commonwealth troops, that we've also already discussed, but also enemy.
And there is also a staggering amount of photographic portraits of because obviously most of the newspapers in the collection are local papers, so they write about local lads.
Absolutely, and that's the thing. That's where the local paper really comes into its own, because they will focus very heavily on telling that personal story of their local lads coming home. And I mean, with 827 newspapers as of today, it will change.
And counting,
it changes on a daily basis. If you're watching this in a few months' time, it'll be over 1,000 newspapers, and so on and so forth. We also, of course, have a lot of detail on the women's services and, as I say, my personal bias, the home front, rationing, what was happening for bombing and evacuation. And so there's a little food bulletin tip there from a newspaper. If we just move to the next slide, we'll just have a look at some of these. So we have a look at promotions and exchanges, and it just mentions by name the gentlemen who were being promoted or moved around, and the Royal Berkshire Regiment, 2nd Royal Berkshire Regiment, will leave Athlone on August 10th for Templemore. And I mean, it's so very precise.
No, it really is, isn't it?
It's not just they've gone or they're going. It is on August 10th. They will move from Athlone in the Midlands of Ireland, and they will go to Templemore. And then there's various people who have been replaced. It has to be said that in a lot of newspapers, there is a bias towards the officers.
I can imagine. Yeah, I mean, the class system was so prevalent back then.
So you will, and even when we get later to something else, you'll see that, enlisted men are listed separately to officers.
Okay.
When it comes to the casualty lists, unfortunately. So we just move to the next image.
Oh, wow.
And so these are some of the things you find. This is another portion on the top left, is another portion of that battlefield picture, and some incredible pictures of tanks, and I'm sure my husband would be able to tell me exactly what type of tank it is. And then we have the 9 women's services, and I just thought that was a lovely photograph.
That is lovely. I've never seen that before.
Dare name them off the top of my head just from looking at their uniforms, other than my own personal obsession, the Women's Land Army there at the end. Or perhaps it's the Timber Corps and I've got it entirely wrong. But yeah, no, the Timber Corps, the Women's Land Army, they're just such fabulous resources, and the work of women was equal to men at the time. They were moving aeroplanes, they were, dealing in hospitals, they were drivers. And it's one of those things that, on the one hand, we do want to make a big deal of it, but it was so normalised that they would take part. And these are services that were created during the course of the First World War and continued into the Second World War.
Okay, so a lot of the infrastructure was already there by the time the Second World War had come along. Okay.
Very much like rationing. Rationing, unfortunately, was a bit of a palaver during the First World War.
Yeah, I've heard that.
It wasn't introduced until very late. You had a lot of price rises and that sort of thing. By the Second World War, I mean, with that 1939 register, I just think it is the most amazing logistical feat that was ever done for a war.
No, it is 60,000 numerators or something, wasn't it? Which is just incredible.
And just to be able to feed your nation throughout the war, which, as we know, a lot of the other nations, especially the landlocked nations, really suffered from the rationing issue. But there will be obviously a lot of complaints about rationing in the newspapers as well. So we have an image of a roll of honour there.
That is incredibly sharp. What paper is that from?
I don't recall, I'm afraid. I do have it in my notes, but unfortunately I don't have them with me here. And then one of my personal favourites, which I think was a favourite of, I'll say, all young boys during the war, was these silhouettes of
wow.
domestic and enemy planes.
And I guess that's probably almost a bit of a public service announcement, is it? That's to help people identify what's flying over their
Yes,
houses.
indeed.
And,
Yeah, absolutely. So they could look up into the sky and they would be able to recognise the plane as being friend or foe.
Or it drops bombs, or it doesn't.
Exactly.
Kind of, yeah.
Yes, indeed. And of course, we all have our favourites. I put up the Hurricane, but of course, I think I'm supposed to like the Spitfire. So if we could move on to the next slide. So we do also have a range of specialist military titles, and I'll just list them here and the coverage we have. I have to say that there are some gaps in this coverage, and we will work to complete those gaps. But by the same token, the range of material that you will get from the newspapers, the specialist military newspapers, is quite something. So if we have a look at each of these in turn, if we move to the next slide. So the volunteer service, the Naval and Military Gazette and the Army and Navy Gazette, the ones on the outside edges, left and right, are both for volunteer services. The volunteer service was formalised in 1859. It was a rifle service, and it was to encourage, well, I'm going to say men of a certain class.
Okay, so what, the kind of sporting gentleman type, is it?
Not quite, but certainly run by the sporting gentleman.
Okay.
So a little bit the way sort of one imagines the sort of Dad's Army kind of worked. You had a sort of a gentleman in charge, and then the slightly middle class grouping of men who would meet on a Tuesday night, and they would practice their rifle and their drill. And they paid dues, and they also had to pay for their own uniform. And this could range, and their own weapon. The army didn't want them using the long Enfield rifle because they felt it was too complex for them, but I think they list if they're using the long Enfield rifle in their little descriptions in the newspaper about themselves.
I just found it crazy to think that back then people could have privately owned military service weapons. And...
Oh, absolutely, encouraged to purchase them. So in order to participate in this voluntary service, you really would have a disposable income that would allow you to spend anywhere from £8 to £12 on the accoutrements, the uniform, and they're rather proud of their uniforms. They list the facings that they're using. So you have essentially a grey uniform was said, but they would all dress it up with different facings. So the collars and the cuffs might be sort of black or scarlet or green. And so it wasn't a ragtag affair, but certainly the regular military, never thought very highly of it. It was intended as a force that would assist in, if the country was invaded. There was a fear in the 1850s that France would actually invade. And so this voluntary service was set up. Now, if you consider that, as I said, you had to have about £8 to £12 to participate in this, and then you had to pay dues, like a little subs fee every week or every month. And the average sort of factory worker in the late 1850s, early 1860s is maybe earning £1 a week. It's sort of 12 weeks' wages in order to just even participate in this. So generally speaking, the working classes and the rural communities were in the militia, which were trained by the military themselves, and they went off to a base for a number of weeks to train, and they would receive a certain little sort of pension or a top up to their money, and they could be called up at any time.
Okay.
The voluntary service were, as I say, much more middle class, and then they also were very interested in military things. So obviously newspaper guys saw a great thing, we can sell a new newspaper.
Yeah.
And so they sold this newspaper into that sort of middle class voluntary service. So if we move on to the next one. Also, the other thing that can create a newspaper is when the army moves into town.
Oh.
And a little bit like the Bennets, everybody gets very excited when the army moves into town. And the Aldershot Gazette was created when the army created an army base in Aldershot. Oh,
it's simply because such a large number of new people, men, were moving in.
Population went from 800 to 13,000.
Whoa!
And Portsmouth obviously has always had a long association with the Navy.
Yeah.
But again, the population nearly doubled in the 1850s. And then finally, but we've touched on these before, we have the Illustrated War News, which was produced during the First World War, and the Weekly Casualty List. On the left, the Weekly Casualty List is a very poignant publication, and this is the one that lists the enlisted men separately from the officers.
Okay.
And the Illustrated War News is not only useful for imagery of the entire army and indeed the Axis forces, as well as, or not the Axis forces at that point, but the German forces and the British forces, but also all of the Commonwealth forces. So if you're interested in uniforms in particular, you'll get a lot of information in there.
Oh, wow.
So I think if we just move to the tips to end, and just the one thing I would say is that obviously if you're looking at the really early conflicts, we'll have quite delayed reporting.
Yes.
No telephones, no telegram, certainly no television, and there's no internet. So do broaden your search out for several weeks beyond that campaign.
Cool, yeah, that makes sense. I've seen letters printed in papers from soldiers who were actually dead at the time the letters were printed, but there was no reference to their death in the report, so I'm assuming the local paper and the families had no idea that young man had been killed.
It is quite possible, absolutely. Absolutely. But as I say, I think we'll just leave the search tips up and people can note those down, and we'll leave it at that.
Brilliant, thank you. I guess one final thing I'd like to add, we touched on it briefly, was that photographs, I know, finding a photograph is often a bit of a holy grail with this kind of research, and in many cases newspapers are literally the only place you are going to find a photograph of servicemen, and they were printed with incredible frequency as well in local papers. So yeah, if you're keen to find a photo of your ancestor, do try the newspapers. But yeah, no, thank you so much for that, Eva. That was fantastic. So before we start our group panel, I drag everyone back up here with us. I'd like to introduce a short video that we've produced to share the stories of some very brave young men who gave their lives in service of their country. It's called In Memoriam, and the way we produced it was by using our fantastic collection of newspapers and finding in memoriam poems, which were touching poetic tributes left by grieving families to their relatives who were killed fighting. They're really powerful, and we're very pleased to be able to share this with you now. So yeah.